I'm hoping some of you have seen the modern, seminal UU art house film, a little film entitled Barbie. A tiny, mildly successful film from a few years ago, written and directed by Unitarian Universalist Greta Gerwig. In it, the character of Gloria shares a gut-wrenching soliloquy that spoke to women from all different backgrounds about the work of being a woman. She says, in part, "It is literally impossible to be a woman. You have to be a boss, but you can't be mean. You have to lead, but you can't squash other people's ideas. You're supposed to love being a mother, but don't talk about your kids all the time. You have to be a career woman, but also always be looking out for other people. You have to answer for men's bad behavior, which is insane, but if you point that out, you're accused of complaining. You're supposed to stay pretty for men, but not so pretty that you tempt them too much or that you threaten other women because you're supposed to be a part of the sisterhood. But always stand out and always be grateful, but never forget that the system is rigged. So find a way to acknowledge that, but also always be grateful. You have to never get old, never be rude, never show off, never be selfish, never fall down, never fail, never show fear, never get out of line. It's too hard. It's too contradictory, and nobody gives you a medal or says thank you. And it turns out, in fact, that not only are you doing everything wrong, but also everything is your fault." End quote. During the battle of the gods in ancient Greece, 2 generations of gods went to war. The Titans, whom you can think of as the baby boomers, fought the Olympians, akin to Gen Xers, to see who would take control of the heavens. Ultimately, the younger generation of gods won, and as a punishment for leading the Titans into battle, Atlas, the strongest of the old gods, was condemned to hold the celestial heavens upon his shoulders for all eternity. Many of you may call forth the famous sculpture of Atlas on one knee, resting the earth on his upper back, his muscles straining under the weight of it, his eyes fixed with determination and grit. His burdensome punishment on display for every god and human alike that dared to wonder what sorry creature was holding our world up. I like to imagine what the sculpture might look like in our modern era if we were to once again ask who holds the world up. I would still imagine Atlas as he is, but with a woman hidden just behind him. Her hair in a messy bun, feeding spaghetti to a wily toddler with one hand focusing on the computer screen on her knee, and with her other hand nonchalantly helping to hold the world for Atlas. Her one grounded leg unbent from the weight after centuries of learning to hold it all without an audience's recognition. For those unfamiliar with the term invisible labor, it's work that does not earn a paycheck, is expected, and therefore frequently overlooked by its beneficiaries. A piece by Emily Rutledge, published by the Feminist Studies and Religion Journal, goes deeper, stating that the vastness of what falls under the umbrella of invisible labor rests principally on women and generates the emotional labor which is gendered, considered women's work, and part of an ongoing history of caretaking labor, where women are expected to give their energy, time, and emotional capacity to serve others. While the experiences and opportunities for women differ drastically depending upon race, ethnicity, gender expression, ability, access to education, and socioeconomic situation, when it comes to invisible and emotional labor, the burden falls squarely on the shoulders of women. She goes on saying, "Invisible labor is not calculated as a contribution to families or the community in a way that protects women legally. Research shows that the amount of work that women do in cisgendered heterosexual partnerships does not change even when demographics do. An exception is that across-the-board research on LGBTQ couples has found a much more equitable distribution of household and parenting tasks." End quote. The same trend continues in transgender and gender non-binary parents who also, research has found, have a more equitable distribution. Invisible labor shows up not just in our homes, however, but in many other areas of our lives as well. In fact, the modern church was built on the back of women's unpaid labor. This congregation has a fairly decent spread of gender identities in leadership and volunteer positions, but most congregations, it is women who make the coffee, women who clean the dishes on Sunday, women who volunteer with the nursery or the religious education program or the office, women who make the dishes to bring to the potluck, women who organize the library, women who decorate the fellowship hall, women who visit the sick and send birthday cards. It is women who make community building and service to others one of their highest priorities in spaces like this. Women make the religious world go round. And yet it is women who are often subjugated to the shadows in religious institutions. Women who are told they should not, could not, do not have the God-ordained right to lead. Clearly, it's different here. Why is it that in so many mainstream religions, they see this model of sacrificial and subservient womanhood as the ultimate example of living a religiously authentic life? Women's spiritual work has been erased by religions for centuries, buried in footnotes or left out of canon by men in positions of spiritual authority. When they are left in, they tend to fall into sexist tropes and categories that diminish their role. Of course, the most famous example of this in Christianity is Mary Magdalene, a prominent disciple, witnessed to multiple miracles, helped to personally finance Jesus' ministry. Did you know that? Yeah. And as the story goes, she was chosen as the first person to see him upon his resurrection. But her power and her ministry were somehow deemed less important than the other apostles along the way, and thus she is relegated to merely being a licentious woman. Or a lesser-known apostle, Junia, a follower of Jesus's before many of his most famous apostles, a woman who Paul himself called outstanding among the apostles. She is rarely mentioned, and when she is, it is to share that she has been imprisoned for her beliefs. You may not recognize her name because it was later translated into the masculine version, Junius. There is the labor of Hagar and of the women who served the magically multiplied loaves and fishes to 5,000. 5,000, y'all. Can you imagine serving 5,000 people, doing all the cleanup work, and not getting a mention? Even in our own faith, which was flush with women's abolitionists, many Unitarian women are in that picture right there. Flush with abolitionists and early feminists, we too have overlooked incredibly important work done by female predecessors. To quote from a UU World article on the topic, through what she called threads of fact and fiction, 19th and 20th century author and activist Frances Ellen Watkins Harper challenged Unitarians and other Christians to practice a form of religion that reflected, quote, a stronger sense of justice and a more Christ-like humanity on behalf of those homeless, ignorant, and poor, end quote. A Black woman, she was born to free parents in Baltimore, where she lived until she was 26. She held dual membership in Unitarian and African Methodist Episcopal churches in Philadelphia, and believed the struggles for Black Americans and women of all races were connected. When the Civil War ended, Harper waged a dual campaign for women's suffrage and civil rights for all citizens. In May 1866, she delivered an address to the National Women's Rights Convention in New York, saying before thousands, "Justice is not fulfilled so long as woman is unequal before the law. We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its own members without receiving the curse in its own soul." Yes, preach. Ooh, is she calling right now? Despite her profound work on behalf of women's liberation and the abolition of slavery, despite being what scholars believe was the best-selling African-American novelist before the 20th century, her works were largely forgotten until scholars and Unitarian Universalists resurrected her legacy about 30 years ago. As you can see, for as long as we have lived in a patriarchal and especially a capitalist society, women have provided invisible labor to support our families, our jobs, and our communities. So why is it becoming a mainstream topic now? The shifting gender and economic dynamics in the US has a role to play in this. Women made up 47% of the US workforce in 2024. So for many, the normal level of invisible labor is now heaped on top of a full-time job. When there was a greater possibility to comfortably support a family of 4 on a one full-time salary, we could spread the workload amongst 2 adults. But as that changed and we began to require 2 incomes to support a family, the invisible labor that had always been there, will always be there, did not evolve with the new demands. This all came to a head during the pandemic, which created a new level of transparency for invisible labor, and the statistics that pandemic produced around this continue to need to be reconciled with. One study said 80% of US adults who weren't working during the pandemic because they had to care for their children who were not in school or daycare were women. This may seem obvious to some of you, but when women are forced to sacrifice their careers, they lose their economic independence, their identities outside of their familial role, and ultimately place themselves at greater risk of lifelong poverty should their relationships end. So the inability to share this invisible labor more equitably can sometimes mean the difference between merely surviving and actually thriving for women and families. This reality is even harsher for women of color who bear the brunt of both sexism and racism and experienced exacerbated career and financial setbacks during the pandemic, which deserves its own sermon. We had an opportunity coming out of COVID to be honest about these revelations. We could have, as a country, chosen to address the inequities that serve as barriers towards women's and thus all of our continued happiness and success. We could have chosen to protect women's rights to reproductive choice. We could have chosen to vote for women in leadership and elected office, to provide paid parental and sick leave for both parents so that they can be present and active in their children's early lives. We could have chosen to provide affordable, quality, even subsidized childcare options. But it seems we have only doubled down. Rolling back women's rights, taking away access to affordable health care, creating structural barriers for women to vote, and creating a nutrition crisis when SNAP benefits were lost. And don't even get me started on the new Louis Theroux's Manosphere documentary on Netflix, which highlights the growing presence of online influencers selling domination as masculinity. Before we get too depressed, however, it's not all doom and gloom. There's a subtle shift happening that's worth mentioning. As generations pass, more and more men are taking active and, in some cases, primary roles in raising their children. Though still not equal, they are beginning to share the workload of household chores more evenly because the longer they are immersed in the day-to-day workings of parenting and managing a household, especially during COVID, they begin to understand the tremendous demands and pressure placed upon their partners. More and more women, and particularly women of color, are running for office, and particularly fewer women are willing to bite their tongues when they experience harassment or inequality. And while millennials are often labeled as lazy or unmotivated to work, we're finding that in reality, they're simply shifting their values towards their home life, their families, away from their work life in a way that was previously unseen by many generations. I believe this shift has occurred because the men in our lives have begun to pay attention in new ways. Ding, ding, our worship theme for the month, paying attention. And so this is an invitation to everyone to pay attention to the ways people, and specifically women, hold our world together in often overlooked ways. Pay attention to the things we take for granted because they are just automatically done. Take the opportunity to seek the people out who are fulfilling those tasks and tell them that they and their work is not invisible to you. Ask them. Tell them that you are grateful for what they do, and if you can, ask them how you can shift some of the weight of the world off of their shoulders. Women are powerful. We are change makers who have often been required to do so in the cover of night, behind the scenes, and without credit. This is why it seems so essential for those in power to seek to control us, to over-police our bodies, to discredit our concerns, to preach a theology of disempowerment wrapped in the clothing of patriarchal compliments. It is an attempt to disenfranchise us, to make us forget our own power. We have a long way to go, friends, with much due to those who have sacrificed to get us to where we are today. But like many areas of our world, there is a ways more to go until the weight of the celestial heavens is shifted from the backs of women and more evenly distributed. May we do our part to ease the burden for one another. May it be so. Amen, and blessed be.